Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin, and we have Jonathan over here, and we're going to talk Syria today. Obviously, if you've been paying attention to the news, there's been an immense amount of change to a conflict that we thought was static. So over the past 2 weeks, that was just completely blown away, and Assad is gone. So we want to do I don't want to call it a deep dive, but we're going to discuss the Syrian Civil War, how we got to where we are now, who the major players are, and where the future may lie. And spoiler alert, your guess is as good as anyone's.
Yep, I think all you can kind of go on is what's happened in the past, what countries' interests are, and where those paths might lead us. So we'll explore that a bit. Before we get there, though, Justin finally did his homework. He went to the Highland Park Brewery this past week, and he got a beer. The reason I was hoping Justin would get down there is I neglected to get to Highland Park Brewery at the Great American Beer Festival, and they were a big winner. I think they won 4 gold medals or something like that. So that's a pretty good recommendation, and figure we're doing our due diligence. And since Justin is in the area, he could check it out for us. And I'm going to pass the torch this week to Justin to tell us about the beer from Highland Park.
Right. So I got it's called Ultra Cloud Hazy IPA. I normally don't like IPAs, but this one's not too bad. It's not bitter. You can see how hazy it is. It is described as having massive tropical aromas of lychee, guava, and mango gelato. I'll be honest.
Mango gelato as opposed to mango?
Yeah, I didn't get that. It is certainly fruity, though.
Okay.
And it cuts into the bitterness of the beer. So from my perspective, it's tolerable, right? Like I said, I'm more of a stout, sour, or Belgian kind of guy. Really don't like these IPAs, but this one, it's drinkable and enjoyable.
And I think that's just a general experience of the hazy IPAs, right? A lot of them are going to be fruit bombs. A lot of them are even going to be sweeter than that and not particularly balanced. Do you like the balance of this one?
It's balanced, really balanced.
Glad you found one you like, and I'm glad we can expand our horizons a little bit from all the Colorado-centric stuff that I usually come up with.
So I think it's a good time to talk about Syria now. As we all know, that the Syrian Civil War started in 2011 during the Arab Spring. So to refresh your memory, there were popular uprisings in many Arab countries, ranging from Libya to all the way to Syria. And, some were successful, like in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood ended up taking over. And, there were some reforms. Jordan had some reforms as well. And the Hashemites were able to keep control of their kingdom. But in Syria, the leader, Bashar al-Assad, he decided that he wanted to maintain power with an iron fist. And so when there were protests in Syria, he just went to town on them, tear gas, live ammunition, you name it. And the country quickly devolved into a civil war. And it just had immense amounts of death.
And that's really kind of very on brand for the Assad family, as they say today. His father, notorious for doing the same thing, where he basically burned a city to the ground and basically paved it over when there were protests and potential revolts against him back before the turn of the century, as I recall. But it's the kind of thing that apparently leaves a mark in that family. They decided, you know what, we're going to kill them all rather than negotiate, and that's how we ended up, as you say, in this civil war that's continued for quite a while. And now Assad is out.
Yeah. So in 2013, he used chemical weapons, and the Obama administration, famously said, "This is our red line," but seemingly didn't do anything militarily to help overthrow Assad. I understand, his point of view, given that we were somewhat in a quagmire with Afghanistan at the time. Iraq was, we left. Right. And then we had to come back because ISIS formed. So I could totally understand not having the political capital of doing anything serious outside of counterterrorism operations against ISIS, which we did. But I do think that by showing, I don't want to say call it weakness per se, but a desire to not get more involved, that invited other players to come into the fold.
Yeah,
So
I was even at the time. I don't remember if you and I discussed this at the time or not, but my thoughts were, if we don't do anything, then it's just opening the door to the Russians. It wasn't really a surprise when the Russians got more involved because they've had interests in that, certainly in the Middle East and in Syria in particular. And I was, don't pine for much that Ronald Reagan did, but example like when Gaddafi was acting up back under Reagan's presidency, bombing Gaddafi's compound kind of put the fear of God in him and made him pull back a little bit. Similar kind of thing wouldn't have required a whole lot of political capital from Obama and would have at least let him know we're serious, if not outright wipe out the higher levels of his administration and possibly take him out, make the thing fall earlier before Russia could get involved. But in any case, we didn't do that. And it's the kind of thing that's it's going to encourage him. Is like, oh, they say they have a red line, but we crossed it. They know it. They didn't do anything. And we can keep hoping to get the Russians involved, which, again, eventually they did.
yeah.
Now, in the long term, having the Russians humiliated like they are right now, that's not so bad for us either. However, there's been a lot of misery in Syria in between. And if we could have avoided that, it certainly would have been better for Syria, and probably could have been better for us if in terms of relations with people on the ground.
Yeah. So, the Russians got involved in 2015, really bombed the shit out of the rebels. And, by 2018, it was basically understood that Assad had effectively won. And, he had been expelled by the Arab League once the Civil War started. But by 2023, he was invited back. So if someone on their bingo card had Assad will fall during Biden's lame duck presidency, good for you. But it was just not on anyone's radar except, maybe a select few in the CIA and in the Turkish government. So obviously, now that Assad is gone, people are ecstatic. And, there are many people who say, oh, well, what's going to happen next could be worse. It's better to have the devil that you know than the devil you don't know. But I think that takes the humanity out of everything, right? These people suffered immensely. They have gone through hell. I encourage everyone to look at some of the torture chambers, the amount of clothing that belonged to all these people who were executed. In a way, it reminds me of what you'd see in like an Auschwitz concentration camp. It is legitimately horrible. And I think you do yourself a great disservice by just looking at numbers and you don't actually see what some of these atrocities are. Because if it's just a statistic and you remove a person from it, why would you care? It's just a number.
I think both perspectives are useful to know here, because I think knowing some of the individual situations is a way to illuminate these statistics, right? Because the statistics do have a power that we should pay attention to. A certain number of people are killed. That's a tragedy. Greater numbers are killed. More and more of a tragedy. It should hopefully, as the numbers go up, attract more interest from people and governments throughout the world. But I think in the end result, I think you're right. It's like anytime a dictator like that is removed from the scene, at the very least for his population, it's probably going to be a good thing. You can't say it always is, right? Because you can look at somebody like the Khmer Rouge taking over. That didn't go particularly well. You can look at the Taliban taking over. That didn't go particularly well for much of the population there, right? So we don't really know. But I think it's probably kind of safe to say whoever takes over, at least at first, isn't going to be as bad as Assad. Now, we don't know for certain, right? But it seems to be, it would be hard to be worse than him immediately in any case.
Yeah. So I understand your argument that obviously a number that's greater is more of a tragedy. I think that goes without saying. But I do think that once you hit a certain threshold, and you've kind of become numb to it, it invites acceptance. And we clearly saw that by the Arab League bringing Assad back into the fold in 2023. And I understand that it was the political reality, but he still is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I don't think the Arab League is known for being particularly concerned with human rights and domestic civil rights, right? That's, I mean, you think about the Saudis, and that's one of the main drivers there. That's not their big thing. It's like they're much more interested in ruling, right, than in advancing rights for their citizens, and certainly caring about rights throughout. So I don't think it's a matter of they became numb to the numbers. I just don't think they care.
Well, America certainly did, right?
Sure, but you're talking about the Arab League.
No, I understand, but specifically the Arab League as an example of the world just coming to accept that, okay, you know what? Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, but the world's just keep on spinning. And yeah, I just would prefer to live in a world where that isn't the
Certainly.
case.
Certainly. And I would actually think we'd be better off, again, if we're doing both. It's like, hey, these numbers are going, we should do something about this.
Right.
And here's an example of what's going on to a certain person or a certain subset or a group of people. And this is how miserable it is for these people. I remember that, like, when the stuff happened in Aleppo, right, back in the during the 2016 election, and Gary Johnson, famous for not even knowing what Aleppo was. It's like people don't pay attention in this country as much as they should, right? And if we can, I've always been, like, in political science focus anyway, data plus case study. To me, that's the most convincing argument. So I want to know the numbers, and then I also want to know what's going on individually. And I know a lot of people aren't that curious, but we could probably benefit from some of that as well. Whatever is the best way to break through people's consciousness, I agree, is what we ought to do. Hopefully people don't get numb to things like the numbers, because some of them are really horrific. But if you do get numb to that, you're right that these, the narratives and the evidence what we're seeing now is just should convince you this guy should have gone a while ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about where we are now.
Okay.
The demographics of Syria are interesting because Assad was Alawite, which is a pretty small demographic within Syria. It's roughly 10% of the population.
That's a Muslim sect, by the way, for people.
Yeah, they're Shia Muslims. And so the country has been ruled by a minority for the past half century. Unlike Lebanon, which is a more balanced situation between Christians, Shia Muslims, and Sunni Muslims, Syria is mostly Sunni Muslim. And if you know your Middle Eastern demographics, Iran is primarily Shia Muslim. And Syria and Iran have been pretty close allies for a while. Iran has been funneling money into Hezbollah, and Hezbollah was on Assad's side. Hezbollah has caused an immense amount of suffering in Syria. And so now that the Assad government is gone, well, now how is Hezbollah going to be rearmed? It's going to be much more difficult.
Well, what's interesting, too, I mean, you think about these demographics, right, that Syria under Assad was a Ba'athist government, right, and allied more or less with Iraq, also a Ba'athist government, except they were dominated by the Sunnis. So it's one of the weird few, and if you don't know your Middle East demographics, the Sunnis and the Shiites famously do not get along particularly well. So there's all sorts of tensions within the region, within the state, in terms of what's going on with alliances and different sects within Islam. Also of note, when you're talking about Syria and Iran, Iran is not an Arab country, right? So that's another division that kind of gets papered over, but now maybe not with Assad out. Then the historical conflict between the Arabs and the non-Arabs in the Middle East, probably, again, another reason why things might get more difficult for Iran to have influence within Syria.
Right. Christians prior to the Civil War were about 10% of the population. It's down to 2%. So it'll be interesting to see how many of them come back.
I'm going to guess very few. Most countries where the Christian
Right.
population flees,
They're gone
they
for good.
generally haven't been coming back.
Yeah.
Especially if this new government becomes a rather Islamist kind of government. There's not
Right.
going to be a lot of place for Christians in that sort of world.
Yeah. And another famous non-Arab demographic are the Kurds. So the Kurds are interesting because there's about 40 million of them spread between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And there are a lot of countries interested in making sure that the Kurds do not have a state. Assad was interesting with the Kurds because the Kurds weren't really against him. They were kind of self-governing, and when you're fighting a civil war, if you have a group that doesn't want to be involved, that's kind of a win for you. So in a way, the Kurds were neutral in this conflict to some degree, and they were backed by America, of course, because America has a pretty long relationship with the Kurds, going all the way back to the war in Iraq, actually the first Gulf War.
Yes. Now, I think it's interesting. It's useful, I think, here to maybe just give a little bit of picture about where we're at now on the ground in Syria. And so I think where we're at right now is very uncertain. Right?
Very uncertain.
There's a bunch of different groups that have taken over different tracts of territory, from the Kurds to the more mainstream resistance movements, to a resistance movement basically that's an arm of the Turkish government. And all of these people are going to be competing for influence to try to figure out what happens in the state, right? In the state of Syria. So we're unsure. Most of them, exception of the Kurds, tend to be Islamist at this point, right?
Right.
So it seems that there's going to be definitely a more religiously focused government. In terms of what that means, we don't know. Can it be could it be sort of a Hezbollah thing where, Hezbollah itself is very radical, but they don't seem to be Taliban-like radical in terms of controlling the government or controlling the population? Could they devolve into something more along the lines of the Taliban? One of the main elements of the Syrian resistance that basically won is descended from Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda, not known for being middle of the road, right? So this group has disavowed.
Hey now. With ISIS involved, I would argue that when you look at your terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda is the more moderate one.
Well, more moderate than ISIS is kind of damning with faint praise, isn't it? But in any case, it remains to be seen how motivated by religious fervor all these groups are, right? Do they want to go back to full-blown Sharia law and some sort of weird mirror image of Saudi Arabia combined with Afghanistan? Who knows what they want to do, right? I doubt it will be. I doubt it's going to end up being a secular country, right? I don't see a secular government in the works in Syria, but right, these various competing groups aren't necessarily happy with being second fiddle, right? For example, Turkey has had its allies attack the Kurds, and we'll get to this more in a little bit when we talk about the interests. But there's going to be a lot of give and take going on in Syria for a while. Right. I think they're going to have more instability before there's less.
Right. So I think the three main players right now are HTS, which is, as you said, was this Al-Qaeda offshoot. Mm-hmm. So the leader was actually working with ISIS at one point in Iraq. So if you remember ISIS, you had al-Baghdadi. He was the leader. He sent this guy, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, to Syria to fight in Syria. And he was actually pretty disgusted by ISIS's tactics and basically said, oh, you know what? I got to ally with Al-Qaeda in order to have street cred, so to speak. And eventually he sort of evolved over time to be much more pragmatic in terms of ruling. And I think the Hezbollah example that you gave is a really good one because his organization has, it's militant, right? HTS is a militant group, but there's also a political slash administrative arm, much like Hezbollah,
Mm-hmm.
that is catering to the population. And if you look at how well Syria is administered in each of these regions, his organization is actually doing a much better job than the rest, and it has one of the higher standard of livings in the country. The other groups, as you mentioned, are the SDF, who are the Kurds, backed by America, and then the Syrian National Army, SNA, those are backed by the Turks. And so you have these three groups, and it seems that the Turks and the HTS, we'll call them Al-Qaeda Light, are allied. And they seem to currently have some sort of agreement in terms of running the country as of now. That could obviously change, right? There are a lot of state players that are going to come into the region quite soon.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's sort of overlooked a little bit is that these ISIS types, they didn't go away. They're in prisons right now, and then their families are in these basically gulags, and there's a lot of them. And if there's a further breakdown in some of these prisons, right, and these people get out, then you'll have an ISIS element to worry about again. So yeah, it's far from determined whether these allies of convenience in overthrowing Assad will manage to work out an arrangement to seamlessly or at all smoothly transition to a new state government. Hopefully, right, the HTS people who are saying that they become moderates, they don't believe in global jihad, they want to govern Syria. Hopefully they're serious, right? Hopefully they mean that, and they can have an accord with the Syrian, the Turkish-backed forces, and come up to some sort of stable Syria. Hopefully that's not a pipe dream, but it might be, right? You think about what happened in Libya. You talk about Libya in the Arab Spring. After Gaddafi was killed, Libya completely went to hell, and it's
Still is hell.
kind of, it's so that's sort of the worst case scenario.
Right.
If you could become something along the lines of what happened in Egypt, that's kind of the best case scenario. Egypt, at the very least, is stable. Now they've kind of transitioned to the next dictator, but the civil society in Egypt still exists. It's not ridiculously oppressive in the way that the Assad government was. So there's all kinds of room for something to happen in between those poles.
Right. So in our show notes, we have this BBC article that sort of profiles al-Jilani. He's definitely moderated over time. And it's not just after Assad got overthrown. He's been moderating for many, many years now. So to quote from the article, it says, "From the start, he prioritized winning Syrian support, distancing himself from ISIS's brutality and emphasizing a more pragmatic approach to jihad." You know, it's kind of funny to read that, but in a lot of ways it's true, right? He has pushed against hardliners, and recently he even said that we are going to ban the forced wearing of the hijab. So again, he's saying the right things right now. Whether or not we should take him at his word, it's really hard to say. Right now, the United States has HTS as a terrorist organization, right? And so when you do that, that has severe economic implications. And so I think one of the debates that the Biden administration currently has, and obviously the Trump administration is going to have this debate as well, is should we keep that? Is it going to do more harm than good?
Yep. And I think one thing we definitely need to be careful of when we're thinking about that is remembering that throughout history, a lot of people moderate themselves to have allies and win. And then once they've won, they remember that they're not really all that moderate to begin with. Right. So, I mean, the biggest example you could think of would be like Soviet Russia. Stalin played nice with the US and the UK when they needed us, and he needed us for the war. But as soon as he didn't anymore, he went back to not playing nice. All kinds of examples of that throughout history where, when you need somebody's help or you need the support of the people or whatever, you do nice things. But whether you continue to do that once you've won, that will be the true test. And I think that will give whatever they do once they're things calm down a little bit, will hopefully give us some ideas of which direction we should go with them as a country.
Right. So now that we've described all the organizations, I shouldn't say all the organizations, but the main organizations within Syria, let's talk about the state players. So we have America, of course. We're interested in everything. There's Turkey. They're very interested in the outcome of Syria. Russia is very interested in what happens because they have a Navy base in Syria right now that is used to project power throughout the Middle East and Africa. So if they lose that, that is just devastating for them. Iran is obviously interested. Prior to October 7th, I think Iran was in fairly good position in terms of strength projection. But with the loss of Hezbollah and the war in Gaza and what's happened in Syria with losing Assad, I think Iran has just been utterly devastated in their ability to project power. And then lastly, we have Israel. They are very interested in what happens in Syria because they share a border. And, if you know your history, you know that the Golan Heights, which has been annexed by Israel, it was formerly Syrian territory. Well, now that they have a regime change, they're very interested in what's going to happen on their border.
Yep. And I think you also worth mentioning Europe. The EU is interested because they've been a destination for a lot of refugees, right. And a number of countries in Europe, if not all of them, would be happy to see some of these refugees go home. But they'd certainly all be happy to see no more streams of refugees coming out. So hopefully the country will be better and not have that happening, right? So yeah, I think it is useful to kind of go through what the interests are for the major players right now, right? And if you start, we probably ought to start with us since we're Americans talking here in the United States. What is our interest? And we have some obvious interests, right? We don't want ISIS to reemerge, right? We support the Kurds, though. And the Kurds, and at the very least, the Turkish-backed forces don't get along. Even after Assad fell, Turkey had its forces attack the Kurds. And these are the Kurds who we are supporting. So we have some issues with Turkey as an ally. We definitely have some issues with Turkey's forces being sent against the people who we support. So it'll be difficult, I think, for us to negotiate, to navigate sort of that tightrope, to figure out how to keep our support for the Kurds without fighting Turkey directly, because we're certainly not going to do that, right? But we still, we have people there supporting this kind of stuff. I can't remember the exact number of forces we have on the ground now. It's not much, right? But there are American advisors over there still with the Kurds, and so that's going to be an issue. At the same time, as you mentioned before, right? We don't know what to do about HTS. Do we still call it declare a terrorist organization? Do we give them benefit of the doubt because they're now in charge of a country? Who knows, right? And we do also know that Trump has a history of not wanting to be involved at all in Syria. He wanted to pull everybody out immediately and was talked down at one point in time. But his goal now is not to get us involved in a war in Syria, right? So if you're the Kurds, I think I'm going to be a little bit nervous, right? In terms of how much more American support do you have coming, and if the American support dries up even more, are the Turks going to come and try to wipe us out? So the United States has an important role to play, but it's very indeterminate what we're going to do because of our regime change that's coming up.
Right. And so you mentioned the Kurds. Well, Turkey, their foreign minister, recently said that it is a strategic goal to eliminate the Kurds in Syria. Right? Not the Kurdish population, but the organization.
And I think, maybe that's a good sort of segue to go into what Turkey's interests are, right? Because they do back the SNA and not so much the HTS, even though they're kind of allied right now because they had the same goal. But they have an interest in cutting down the refugee issue and being able to send people back, right? But their historical larger interest, as you're saying, is twofold. One, stopping the Kurds from having any kind of country, right? There's a large Kurdish minority within Turkey, and they've been fighting for independence a long time, and they've been Turkey has branded them a terrorist group, and they say basically all Kurds everywhere are terrorist groups. The Kurds in Iraq, the Kurds in Syria, Kurds everywhere
Yeah.
are basically Turkey's enemy. So they want to contain and, as you said, wipe out at least their political influence. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and hope that they're not planning to kill all the Kurdish population, which I don't think they really are. But they want to make sure that the Kurds are part of whatever country they happen to live in and not carve out an independent Kurdistan, which
basically
for a while.
Neuter the political organization.
Yes. At the same time, right, Turkey has had an historic rivalry with Russia for a long time, right? You can go back to as far back as you want. I think just for our purposes, you can go back to World War I and think about the idea of Turkey and Russia being opponents there. In World War II, Hitler tried to get Turkey to attack Russia. We managed through diplomacy to keep Turkey from doing that. And then in the Cold War and then post-Cold War era, Turkey was a very important ally for us. There was sort of the southern bulwark against Russia expanding into the Mediterranean, right? Turkey is very important for us. After the Cold War ended, Turkey is still an ally for us, and it used to be a very important ally in the Middle East. But after Erdogan came to power, we've sort of drifted apart a little bit. They're still a member of NATO, so still an ally of ours, but they're much more likely to step up and do what they want to do rather than kind of agree to toe the American line. A lot of that is still rivalry with Russia. They would like nothing more than to see Russia get out of Syria completely, right? Basically, the two Turkish goals would be no Russia in Syria, no independent Kurdish state, right? Yeah. If those things happen, they'll figure out what to do with the refugees. I think that while they're concerned with that, the strategic interests, I think, are going to trump what they're after in Syria at this point.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of geography, Turkey is just a huge blessing for America, but they're also a huge pain in the ass. I mean, one day we'll have a podcast dedicated to American-Turkish relations because it's really fascinating. For a country that size, they really punch above their weight class.
Yeah, they really rely on the fact that they're sort of a linchpin ally, and so they poke the bear quite a bit. Well, actually, that would be poking the Russians. They poke us quite a bit. Yep. They do whatever they feel like doing, especially as Erdogan has become more. I don't want to say fanatic is the wrong word, but more sort of religion forward and changed the Turkish government. It used to be written in law, we're going to be a secular society. That was the whole point of Turkey, and the military was there to enforce that. He's gone the other way and made it a more and more religious society. And along with that comes certain, let's say, imperatives that clash with the United States policies and ideas more often than it used to.
Right. So we mentioned Russia and how they have that key base in Syria. And, it's funny because that is up in the air. Russia is desperately trying to negotiate with HTS in order to keep that base, because without it, they could move to Libya, I suppose, have a base there. But their ability to project power in both the Middle East and Africa would be severely hampered. It's also very awkward because the number 2 source of casualties and death in Syria were the Russians. The Russians bombed the shit out of Syria and killed thousands of people. And I don't think HTS is going to forget that. So we'll see what happens. Maybe they lose it. Maybe there's just like some sweetheart deal. But we'll see.
So I think, in terms of their ability to project power, one, as you say, that they fought against HTS and for Assad. And that's a tough deal to strike. But in terms of people respecting Russia's ability to project power, like they backed Assad, and now he was kicked out in amazingly rapid fashion, right? That's already killed Russia's credibility in the area and probably quite a bit in Africa. If you're a dictator and you're relying on Russian support to stay in power, you're taking note of this, right? When push comes to shove, how useful are the Russians? And the answer is not very. And even on the ground, right, there's been reports that the Russians are asking the Turks for help evacuating from parts of Turkey, or parts of Syria, rather. So things don't look good for the Russians in Syria. And I think this is potentially a really huge setback for them in the entire region.
Right.
Unfortunately, probably good news for the Chinese, right? Because they're competing in influence in a lot of places where the Russians want to have influence. But hopefully, it can be an opening for us to have better relationships with some of these countries if you realize, you know what, if I'm dealing with Russia, they're not reliable. Maybe the United States could be more reliable. Now, whether Donald Trump can sell that message is another story. But at the very least, getting Russian influence down can't be a bad thing.
Right. And we mentioned before Iran severely weakened. I don't think there's anything else to say. They've just lost an immense amount of influence.
One thing about
Sure.
Iran is I think it's like, I think as time goes on, it seems more and more clear that they probably didn't know exactly what Hamas was planning, right? Because they certainly didn't hope for this kind of outcome, right? Where Hamas is more or less not wiped out to the man, but wiped out as a functioning entity that can be a strategic asset. And
Right.
Hezbollah has been neutered, and now Syria is gone, right? And Israel has demonstrated they can basically bomb you at will, and you
Right.
can't do much about it because if you attack back, they can knock out with American help anything you send at them, right? So Iran has really weakened itself, as you said, and I think it's just useful to think about some of the details of that. In terms of Israel, as you mentioned before, right, Israel is paying close attention to this because they share a border. The thing that worries me about the Israeli response is they seem kind of trigger happy over there now. They are to me the classic one tool in the box kind of state right now. That everything they see, we're going to blow it up, right?
Right.
For example, they blew up the Syrian Navy, right?
Yep.
What is the point of that? I don't understand. It's like, oh, we didn't want it to fall into the hands of the new Syrian government. Okay, that's fine, but you can't hide Navy ships. You know where the Navy ships are. If they become a problem, you can always blow them up later, right? I'm wondering maybe if there's a new government, is there a way to have a peaceful an accord with this new government? I don't think it would be a
Right.
bad idea for Israel to be more pragmatic in terms of potential diplomacy rather than your first thing you do with this new government is blow up their navy, right? Like
Right.
it just doesn't seem like that's kind of another action by Israel that seems to be a tactic or operation without a real strategy behind it. How is that going to help you
Right.
politically?
So I think this boils down to an Islamist regime versus a Ba'athist one, right?
Sure.
So Israel had an agreement with Assad that, hey, on this side of the Golan Heights, it's going to be demilitarized. And on your side of the Golan Heights, it's going to be demilitarized. And that stood for a very long time. And that border, even throughout October 7th and the war in Gaza and the war with Hezbollah, it's been pretty peaceful. And Assad upheld his end of the bargain. I have mixed feelings about Israel preemptively attacking all these weapons. I do think it makes sense to get rid of the chemical weapons because
Sure.
in the worst case scenario where HTS to basically say, a good way to unite everyone is let's be angry at Israel.
Well, see, I actually think that the more realistic danger of that is in a place and time like Syria is right now. Things get loose. Black
Yeah,
markets come in. People take
yeah,
stuff and sell it. So that to me is a much more likely scenario, and that's why I would do the same thing. If you know where the chemical weapons are, blow them up now so they don't get out there to somebody. Because I would be very surprised if HTS is going to go down the path of using chemical weapons against Israel. That would be an
it'd be
invitation
foolish,
to being destroyed, right?
right?
So I don't think that's really. I don't buy that as a reason why Israel would want to do it. I do buy a reason that you know what, these things are loose. Can they control them all reliably? Maybe, maybe not. Let's blow them up. But for the Navy, what is the Syrian Navy going to do to Israel? They're going to pull up offshore and start shelling? No. It's like you could see them coming plenty of. I'm sure the Israelis know where every Syrian ship is all the time. I have no doubt about that in my
Right.
mind.
Yeah, I
So
don't think the Syrian Navy is a threat to Israel.
I
And to
don't.
add even more elements to the mix, the Druze population, Druze, in Syria, Well, they're looking at the situation saying, I don't know if I want to live under an Islamist regime. And so there have been some leaders basically saying, hey, Israel, please annex us, which, that's, can't you just immigrate instead? I feel like annexation is just a recipe for disaster. But I do think that Israel engaging with the new Syrian government and trying to, come up with a diplomatic solution with the Golan Heights is wise. And, if Jelani is as pragmatic as he's saying he is, I think striking a deal with Israel would be really wise, especially since they have a common enemy in Hezbollah. So,
Yep.
If there could be some sort of agreement where they say, hey, you know what? If you monitor the border between Lebanon and Syria and make sure that no weapons go to Hezbollah, then we won't attack you. And if you give us the Golan Heights, we will, recognize this, and that. What? Maybe that's a pipe dream. I don't know. No one really knows at this point, but it should at least be tried.
Yeah, and I think that's, a great place to kind of wrap up what we said and kind of recap a little bit is like, we don't know, right? I think, at least if I'm Syrian, I would have a sense of optimism. I would think there's a chance something good can happen from this. If I am in charge of any of the foreign policies of the countries that we talked about, I would think that there's at least some opportunity there, unless you're Russia, and Russia is scrambling right now. But the other countries involved, Iran too. But let's say Turkey, Israel, the United States have opportunities to do things that we didn't have when Assad was in power. Right? And the opportunities for Russia and Iran are now more limited that Assad is out there. So at least at some level, there's a sense of possibility where that's been missing in Syria for a long time.
Yeah, and nothing builds goodwill than money and rebuilding infrastructure. So, if I'm America, if I'm America, I am just throwing a lot of money. I'm removing HTS as a terrorist organization and just try to build soft power that way, because that can go a long way.
I think you're right in a way. I think I would dangle an offer of something like, hey, we could give you a Syrian Marshall Plan if you don't do X, Y, and Z, right? And see if HTS is willing to go along. And then, okay, now that you're doing this, you've reached these benchmarks, we'll take you off the list, and here's American money and know-how and whatever to, one, expand our power, but two, and not unimportantly, improve the lives of people in Syria so people there are not being killed, don't feel like they have to flee, and might be interested in actually coming back to their homeland.
Yeah, but as you said before, Trump doesn't seem interested. Maybe some of his national security advisors will say, hey, you know what? You're a deal maker. I think we can get a good deal here. Appeal to his ego there, because I do think it would just be an insane opportunity to not at least try. Otherwise, you're just ceding it to the Turks, effectively, Turks and Saudis. All right, so that wraps up this episode. We might have overdone it a little bit on Syria, but in our opinion, it's going to be the main foreign policy. I don't know what the correct way to put this. Arena pile of garbage. Oh, yeah, that's that Trump is going to have to deal with. Right? Yeah, but it has the ability to really reshape the Middle East. There's a lot of opportunity here, but the Middle East could end up in a much, much worse situation if certain things happen. So we're going to be watching this for the next 4 years for sure.
Yes, definitely.
And as always, like, subscribe, tell your friends about this, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Now I'm going to go have my beer for the day.